The village of Drimnan lay hushed beneath a pale Highland dawn, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Mist clung to the heather and slid between the cottages, muffling footsteps and swallowing sound. It was the kind of morning when even the crows seemed reluctant to cry out. That was why the scream, when it came, cut through the quiet with such violence that it sent doors flying open and hearts hammering against ribs. By the time the villagers gathered at the edge of the square, the sound had already dissolved back into silence. They stood in small knots, shawls pulled tight, eyes darting toward the old Macleod cottage at the far end. The door was closed. The windows were dark. Nothing about it suggested that, moments earlier, a life had ended inside. Induous Macleod had lived alone since his wife died 3 winters ago. He was a quiet man, known more for his punctual habits than his charm. Every morning at 6 without fail he opened his curtains, lit his stove, and walked down to the post-box with his collie at his heels. When 6 came and went and no Angus appeared, it was noticed at once. In Drimnan, routine was a kind of religion.br first. Was Morag Fraser, who finally knocked, her hand trembling against the wood. When there was no answer, she tried the latch. The door swung inward easily, too easily, and the smell of iron and cold air rushed out to meet them. Angus lay on the kitchen floor, eyes open, staring at nothing. A single wound marked his chest, neat and dark, as though someone had pressed a finger hard enough to pierce the heart. Here was no sign of struggle. The table was set for one, porridge cooling in its bowl. The kettle still steamed faintly. The windows were locked from the inside, and the back door was bolted. Whoever had killed Angus Macleod had either vanished into thin air or had never needed to leave. The most unsettling thing, however, lay beside the body, placed carefully on the floor as if arranged with intention, was a small, smooth stone painted white. On its surface someone had drawn a black circle, perfectly round, perfectly centred. No one in the village could remember seeing it before. It was not from the riverbank, nor from the nearby hills. It looked foreign, deliberate, and profoundly out of place. By the time the police car wound its way along the single road into Drimnan, the villagers had already decided 2 things. First, that Angus Macleod had no enemies. Second, that whatever had happened inside that cottage was not meant to be understood. The silence of the village thickened, not with grief, but with fear. Doors were locked. Curtains twitched. People spoke in whispers as though the killer might still be listening. He constable from the nearest town did what he could, but Drimnan offered him nothing. No footprints in the damp earth outside the windows. No missing knife from the kitchen drawer. No forced entry. The time of death suggested the murder had occurred just minutes before the scream. Yet no one had seen or heard a stranger enter or leave. In a place where everyone knew everyone, anonymity was impossible. And yet here it was, crouched in the middle of the room like a shadow with no source. Ord travelled fast through the glens, faster than the police report ever could. By mid-morning, the name of the village was already being spoken with unease in nearby towns. A locked room, a harmless old man, a symbol no one could explain. It was the sort of puzzle that made experienced officers uneasy and superstitious ones downright afraid. When Hamish Macbeth arrived later that afternoon, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky as clear and pitiless as the questions waiting for him. He stood for a moment at the edge of the square, taking in the stillness, the closed faces, the way conversation died the instant he approached. Villages like Drimnan had long memories, and longer silences. Whatever had happened here, it had disturbed something deeply rooted. Hamish stepped into the Macleod cottage and felt it at once. The wrongness of the place, the careful calm of a scene arranged to deceive. His gaze fell on the white stone with its black circle, and he frowned. It looked simple, almost childish, and yet it had been placed where it could not be ignored. Imple crimes, Hamish knew, were rarely simple at all, and in a village that prided itself on quiet lives and open doors, a murder this clean, this contained, was not just a crime. It was a message. Hamish Macbeth did not touch the body at first. He stood just inside the doorway, hands in the pockets of his oversized jacket, letting the room speak before anyone else did. Kitchens, he believed, told the truth more readily than people. They revealed habits, interruptions, the small betrayals of routine that occurred just before something went wrong. Porridge on the table had skinned over. That suggested Angus MacLeod had been alive no more than 10 minutes before he died. The kettle, still warm, confirmed it. Hamish glanced at the window. Locked. No condensation disturbed, no latch marks scraped by hurried fingers. He moved slowly, almost lazily, but his eyes missed nothing. Constable hovered behind him, notebook ready, eager to supply facts. Angus had no known enemies. No recent visitors. No valuables missing. The scream had been heard by Morag Fraser, whose cottage stood closest to the square. She had been hanging washing when she heard it, one sharp cry, then nothing. By the time she reached the road, the sound was gone. Mish crouched beside the white stone. It was lighter than it looked, not river-worn, not local. The paint was fresh, still faintly tack. Beneath his thumb, someone had brought it here intentionally and placed it carefully, not tossed it aside. The black circle was too precise for a careless hand. Hamish straightened and glanced around the room again. Everything was tidy, too tidy. Angus was not a fastidious man, according to the villagers. He was orderly, yes, but lived in. Hamish opened a cupboard, plates stacked neatly. A mug set out to dry, aligned just so. Someone had been here before the murder, or after, and had wanted the place to look calm. Outside, the villagers waited in strained clusters. Hamish chose Morag Fraser first, not because she had found the body, but because she would not expect him to. She wrung her hands as he approached, eyes darting past him toward the cottage. "You heard the scream," Hamish said gently. "Aye," she replied. "Near startled me out of my skin. One scream only. Just the one. No sound of a struggle before or after." She shook her head quickly. Too quickly. "No, nothing." Hamish nodded and thanked her, then lingered a moment longer than necessary. Morag's gaze slipped, just briefly, toward the lane behind the cottages. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But it stayed with him. He spoke next to Ewan Mac Ray, who claimed to have been tending his sheep on the hillside all morning. His story was detailed, polished, delivered with the confidence of repetition. Hamish let him talk. People who lied often did so with too much care. When Ewan mentioned hearing nothing unusual, Hamish noticed his jaw tighten ever so slightly at the word scream. Why late afternoon the routine questions had circled back on themselves. Alibis overlapped neatly. No one had seen a stranger. No one had left the village. The official theory began to drift toward the impossible. Perhaps Angus had collapsed, and the wound was self-inflicted. The white stone, some meaningless trinket. Hamish fell. Irritation prickled beneath his calm. He returned to the cottage alone. The light had shifted, slanting through the window at a different angle. He stood where Angus would have stood, by the stove, and looked at the table. One bowl, one spoon, but two chairs pulled slightly away, as though both had been used recently. Hamish's mouth tightened. He checked the back door again, bolted from the inside, yes, but the bolt was old, its wood worn thin. With the right pressure, it could be slid into place from outside through the narrow gap in the frame. It was clever, quiet, something only a local would know. Hamish stepped back into the square as evening settled. The village resumed its silence, but now it felt strained, brittle. Someone here was lying. Someone had screamed or heard more than they admitted. And someone had placed that stone not as a clue to be solved, but as a distraction. The murder was not unsolvable at all, Hamish thought. It was carefully staged to look that way. The following morning, Hamish returned to Drimnan under a sky washed pale with mist, the kind that made every detail sharper and every shadow deeper. The village square had emptied somewhat. People were beginning to resume their routines, but not without glances over shoulders and quiet whispers that trailed like smoke behind them. Hamish began with those who had the clearest connection to Angus MacLeod, starting with his niece, Fiona, who had arrived the previous evening from Inverness. She claimed she had come simply to check on her uncle after a neighbour mentioned his absence from the post. But her hands trembled slightly when she spoke. Betraying nerves she tried to mask with brisk politeness. "I just wanted to see that he was all right," she said, eyes avoiding Hamish's steady gaze. I didn't know anything had happened until the constable came to my door. Did you speak to him yesterday? Hamish asked, letting the question hang longer than necessary. Fiona hesitated. I saw him through the window. He seemed normal, just having his porridge. Her voice caught and she faltered, too neatly rehearsed. Hamish filed the observation away. Normal, yet nervous. Timing vague. Next he approached Ewan MacRae again, the man who had been tending sheep on the hills. Ewan repeated his story, almost exactly, but there were subtle shifts. Yesterday he had said he had seen nothing unusual. Today he added that he thought he might have glimpsed someone moving near the lane behind the cottages. He recounted it as if he had remembered this on the spot, the hesitancy in his voice betraying a need to appear helpful without admitting he had withheld information. Hamish made a note of it. Hen there was Morag Fraser. She had been first on the scene, and yet Hamish sensed a tension there that went beyond shock. She was cooperative, eager to recount the scream, her voice pitched slightly higher than natural, almost as if she were overcompensating for what she might be hiding. I heard it from the garden, she insisted. I ran straight away. Hamish nodded, watching her fingers twist together. She avoided looking at him directly, her eyes darting to the lane behind the cottages again, the same subtle glance she had given the day before. Hamish moved through the village methodically, speaking to anyone who might have passed near the MacLeod cottage. Details were small, sometimes contradictory. A cart heard in the distance when no cart was scheduled. Footsteps claimed on a different path. Someone reported seeing Angus at the door when he had supposedly been in the kitchen. Individually, each account seemed trivial. Taken together, they formed a tapestry of uncertainty, a web of minor contradictions that felt too deliberate to be mere error. Returned to the Leod cottage mid-morning and crouched near the stove, his keen eyes scanning the floor for anything overlooked. Tiny scuff marks near the back door, faint traces of dirt that had been brushed away, a slight smudge on the windowsill where someone may have leaned. Each small detail suggested movement that did not align with the official stories. Someone had been careful, yes, but not perfect, Barra. Hamish called Fiona back in to clarify times. When exactly did you arrive? He asked, noting her hesitation. The story wavered slightly. She had claimed to come before the scream, but her watch showed a later time. Hamish kept his voice neutral, but inside he filed this discrepancy alongside the glances, the evasions, the subtle contradictions. Papa. Why, midday, Hamish felt the pulse of the village change. People were less cautious in their speech now, but more guarded in their eyes. Villagers who had initially been eager to help now seemed to measure each word, as if the wrong phrase might reveal knowledge better left unspoken. Hamish did not press aggressively, he simply let the inconsistencies surface, noting them quietly. The smiles that were too quick, the glances that lingered too long, the eagerness of some to answer every question immediately, all spoke louder than the words themselves. E left the cottage one last time before lunch, standing in the square and letting the wind carry the mist across his face. Drimnan was a small village, and secrets did not travel far before they were noticed. Yet within this tight-knit community something larger and more calculated was at play. Someone had staged the scene, placed the white stone deliberately, and manipulated the narrative of the witnesses. Hamish could sense the hidden motives, the silent manoeuvres, the subtle deceptions weaving through every version of events. The killer, or killers, was still here, moving among the villagers, waiting for the right moment to make the next move. And Hamish, patient and observant, was beginning to see the pattern emerge from the fog. Hamish spent the afternoon walking the narrow lanes of Drimnan, retracing paths that each villager claimed, or failed, to have taken the morning of Angus's death. The mist had lifted entirely, leaving sunlight to glint off the stone walls and wet cobblestones, but the village felt heavier somehow, as though every cottage and garden harboured secret thoughts, simmering resentments and long-buried grudges. Hamish's eyes lingered on details others ignored, a fence gate left ajar that should have been latched, footprints partially obscured by moss, a cartwheel mark in the lane that did not match any registered horse. Nothing decisive yet, but each piece threaded into the larger tapestry he was beginning to see. He returned to the square and began re-examining the villagers' statements with the patience of a man who knew that time, like mist, could reveal what was hidden. Fiona MacLeod, for all her outward composure, had an edge of resentment beneath her deference. She stood to inherit little from her uncle directly, but the loss of guardianship over the cottage and its modest assets could change her standing within the family network. Jealousy mixed with pragmatic concern, nothing violent in itself, but enough, perhaps, to feed secrecy. One Mac Ray's apparent detachment in the initial interviews now hinted at deeper layers. Sheep, he said, were all he cared about, yet his small holding had been in dispute with Angus over grazing rights. There had been a confrontation last spring, heated but publicly forgotten. Hamish noted how Ewan's eyes narrowed slightly whenever the MacLeod cottage was mentioned, as though old frustrations still smouldered beneath the surface. Mo, Ag Fraser, the first on the scene, was more enigmatic. Her story had been consistent, but the eagerness she displayed, the overcompensation in her retelling, suggested a desire to control the narrative. Perhaps fear, perhaps guilt, or perhaps a secret intertwined with someone else's. Her garden abutted the lane behind the MacLeod cottage, giving her an unobstructed view of arrivals and departures. She had the opportunity, and, as Hamish began to suspect, the knowledge that could make her an unwitting accomplice or a deliberate participant. Hamish paused near the back door of the cottage, examining the worn wood again. Whoever had manipulated the bolt from outside had intimate knowledge of the house's mechanics, yet the door's position also implied confidence, a belief that no one inside would be able to challenge the deception. This suggested a perpetrator accustomed to subtlety, someone who could work without leaving obvious traces, someone familiar with the rhythms of Drimnan. E returned to the square to re-interview villagers who claimed peripheral knowledge. Old Mrs. MacFarlane, who baked for Angus weekly, mentioned seeing a stranger's horse tied near the inn early in the morning. The detail seemed innocent, a fleeting observation, yet Hamish noted it nonetheless. No one had accounted for a visitor at that hour. It might be nothing, or it might mark the beginning of a chain of calculated movements designed to mislead. The hours passed. Hamish began to map the motives against the opportunities. Greed, jealousy, and petty disputes were layered atop long-standing community grudges. Ewan's quarrel over land, Fiona's familial stakes, Morag's access to the back lane, they all intersected with opportunity in subtle ways. But no single thread connected neatly to the act itself. The murder had been executed with precision, staged for maximum confusion. The white stone remained an enigma, its deliberate placement hinting at either mockery or misdirect. Shh! Hamish leaned against the low stone wall, eyes sweeping the village. He imagined the movement of each suspect that morning, the slight deviations in their accounts, the tension underlying every story. The web of deception was tangled, yes, but patterns were emerging. Small inconsistencies, glimpsed gestures, and the interplay of personal motives formed a lattice across which he could trace the killer's careful choreography. He returned to the cottage once more as dusk fell, the light waning but still enough to reveal subtle details. A faint scuff on the hearth, unnoticed before, suggested someone had knelt or moved there deliberately. A smudge of dirt near the window implied a brief presence outside without fully entering. Each clue whispered hints, and Hamish felt the threads of the village's collective silence beginning to pull into alignment. Someone had exploited relationships, expectations, and habits to stage the perfect crime. Someone had manipulated the fears and loyalties of Drimnan's residents, weaving motive and opportunity into a seamless deception, and Hamish, patient and observant, now felt the first solid grip of the pattern, just enough to know where to begin untangling the maze. The next morning, the village stirred with cautious optimism. Word had spread that the police believed they had a breakthrough. A set of muddy footprints partially matching Ewan Mac Ray's boots had been found near the back lane, and the authorities were eager to declare him the culprit. In Drimnan, small victories mattered, and the constable was quick to pronounce the case nearly solved. There was a sense of relief in the square, faces relaxing, chatter picking up again, even as the mist lingered low over the hills. Hamish Macbeth watched the scene unfold with measured calm. He had examined the footprints himself, noting the partial match and the distortion caused by the soft soil. It could have been Ewan's boots, yes, but it could also have been someone clever enough to borrow or replicate them. Small things, he thought, mattered more than the grand gestures. He followed Ewan to his cottage, ostensibly to confront him about the prints. Ewan's face paled when Hamish arrived. "I don't understand," he stammered. "I've been tending my sheep all morning. I couldn't." Hamish studied him closely, noting the way Ewan's hands twitched, how his gaze flicked to the window, to the gate, to the lane. "Your boots," Hamish said quietly. "They were near the back lane yesterday morning." Ewan blinked, caught between indignation and fear. "Aye, but I walked there after tending the fields. That doesn't mean—" He broke off, realizing Hamish wasn't buying the explanation outright. The man's story was plausible, but something about his posture, his timing, the too careful alignment of his words felt rehearsed. Meanwhile, in the square, the constable had begun spreading the good news. Drimnan exhaled collectively, villagers nodding at each other, certain the mystery was concluded. Morag Fraser smiled politely. Fiona MacLeod wiped a hand across her forehead in relief. And even the innkeeper mentioned, quietly, that perhaps life could return to its usual rhythms. But Hamish did not share their optimism. He returned to the MacLeod cottage alone, scanning the familiar spaces with a renewed intensity. The white stone with the black circle caught his eye immediately. It had not been disturbed. No one had touched it. In fact, the placement seemed almost taunting now, a quiet declaration that the solution was far from simple. The footprints might have been a convenient coincidence, or a deliberate plant meant to mislead the authorities. Mish crouched near the kitchen door, brushing the dust from the floor with the tip of his boot. He noticed faint scratches along the doorframe, subtle enough that a casual observer would have missed them. They suggested movement, possibly by someone small or someone trying to manipulate the lock without leaving obvious traces. Combined with the stone, the scratches hinted at intelligence, intention, and calculation far beyond a panicked act. Afternoon edged toward evening, Hamish decided to question Morag Fraser again, focusing less on what she said and more on what she did not. "You were first to the cottage," he began. "Did you notice anyone else moving about the lane? Any sound?" Rag hesitated, her eyes flicking to the hedge separating her garden from the lane. I thought I saw a figure, but it was just a trick of the mist, I think." She smiled tightly, but Hamish noticed her fingers clutching the edge of the gatepost. The instinctive grip of someone protecting a secret. Barch left her, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense that the real culprit remained, hidden, comfortably insulated by the foggo. Coincidence and misdirection. The authorities were celebrating a victory. The village was calming, and yet the unease he had felt from the beginning persisted. Footprints could be forged, stories could be rehearsed, and that white stone, so deliberately placed, was a reminder that someone was orchestrating events from the shadows, waiting, patient, confident. As night fell over Drimnan, Hamish walked alone along the edge of the village, letting the cold Highland air clear his thoughts. The moonlight caught the glint of frost on the heather, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. The village slept uneasily, believing the case closed, but Hamish knew better. A false victory had been declared, a narrative shaped for convenience rather than truth. Somewhere in the quiet street someone was watching, waiting for the moment to act again, and Hamish, alert as ever, felt the first sharp edge of what was to come. Hamish returned to the Macleod cottage the following morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The false victory declared by the authorities had done nothing to ease his suspicions. If anything, it had sharpened them. He moved deliberately through the kitchen and living space, eyes trained on the smallest irregularities. The white stone with its black circle still sat untouched on the floor, a mute sentinel that seemed to watch him as he crouched and examined the room again. He traced the scratches along the back door frame with the tip of his boot, then glanced toward the window ledge, where a faint smear suggested someone had leaned there while surveying the street. Small things easily overlooked, but in Hamish's experience, small things often revealed the greatest truths. Tea was when he picked up an old ledger tucked away in a corner cupboard, dusty, yellowed, filled with the day-to-day accounts of Angus MacLeod's modest holdings. that the first threads of the PA began to stir. Among the neatly penned entries, one name caught his attention: Ewan MacRae. But it wasn't just a mention, it was a notation of a debt, decades old, dating back to when Angus and Ewan had been teenagers. The amount was trivial by today's standards, yet the ledger revealed more than money owed. It hinted at long-standing tensions between families, a feud forgotten by most but not erased. Hamish tucked the ledger under his arm and stepped outside, his mind turning over the connections. He sought out Fiona MacLeod next, ostensibly to discuss the inheritance and caretaking of the cottage, but he steered the conversation carefully. "Your uncle kept meticulous records," he said, sliding the ledger onto the table between them. "Sometimes the past leaves marks we forget to notice." Buff. Ona's eyes widened, a flicker of unease passing over her face. I don't know much about these old accounts," she replied, but her fingers lingered on the pages, betraying familiarity. Hamish noted the hesitation. Something linked her to the past in ways she hadn't yet revealed. H then called on Morag Fraser, whose presence had always seemed peripheral but whose access to the back lane had made her a subtle player in the unfolding drama. Hamish asked her about the old MacLeod-MacRae disputes, framing the question as idle curiosity. Morag's initial reaction was guarded. She spoke carefully, highlighting only the minor squabbles she remembered, but her eyes betrayed recognition. There was history here she was unwilling to name aloud. By 8 afternoon, Hamish had pieced together a skeletal web connecting the villagers. Ewan's long-standing grievances, Fiona's potential inheritance, Morag's intimate knowledge of comings and goings, none of it explosive on its own but taken together. Patterns emerged. Then a chance remark from the innkeeper, casual in its delivery, provided the missy. Years ago, Angus had mediated a dispute involving Morag's late husband, a disagreement over land that had left old scars and grudges festering beneath polite conversation. Suddenly, the placement of the white stone, the carefully staged murder, the seemingly random sequence of events, it all began to point toward a design influenced by history, memory, and old resentment. Hamish returned to the MacLeod cottage as twilight descended, moving slowly through the rooms, letting the connections sink in. The ledger now lay open on the table, revealing more than numbers. It revealed patterns of trust and betrayal, favours and perceived slights, obligations and resentments spanning decades. The stone on the floor was not just a taunt, but perhaps a message aimed at those who knew the old history, a signal only recognisable to someone attuned to the hidden currents of Drimnan. As he stood by the window, watching the last light fade over the hills, Hamish felt the strands of the past intertwining with the present. The crime was not merely the result of a fleeting impulse, it was an orchestration built upon old enmities, carefully concealed motives, and the silent manipulations of people who had lived their lives within the narrow confines of the village. Someone had exploited decades of relationships and memory to engineer the perfect deception. Hamish breathed deeply, sensing the weight of history pressing down on the quiet village. The past was no longer a background murmur. It had become a living, breathing force in the present. Whoever had killed Angus MacLeod had roots buried deep in Drimnan's collective memory. And Hamish now understood that the key to unravelling the mystery lay not in the immediate chaos, but in the shadows of the past, where grudges, debts, and silent resentments waited patiently for their reckoning. Bah! Mish returned to the MacLeod cottage the next morning with a plan that was less about physical evidence and more about observing human nature. The village had grown restless under the scrutiny of the authorities, satisfied that Ewan MacRae was the likely culprit, but Hamish knew that the real answer lay beneath the veneer of calm. He needed a clue that could bypass rehearsed statements, one that would elicit an instinctive reaction rather than a calculated response. He gathered Fiona MacLeod and Morag Fraser in the kitchen, under the pretense of reviewing the ledger and discussing the inheritance, leaving the white stone untouched in the centre of the room. Hamish had noticed the way both women had glanced at it in earlier visits, a subtle recognition that suggested the object held significance beyond its apparent simplicity. He set the ledger open on the table and tapped a finger on a blank page before speaking casually. "Times," he said, letting his voice drawl just enough to seem conversational. "Objects carry more than meaning, they carry memory. The smallest thing can remind someone of something they'd rather forget. The right object, in the right place, and a person can't help themselves." Ona's fingers twitched on the edge of the table. Morag shifted slightly, her gaze flickering toward the stone for a fraction of a second before she corrected herself. Hamish allowed silence to linger, observing. "Imagine some of the old disputes Angus kept track of might have left scars," he continued. "Small slights, long grudges, a debt that wasn't repaid, an argument that ended badly. The mind remembers even when we try to forget." He leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, and let the tension settle. Then, almost imperceptibly, he moved the white stone closer to Morag. Not dramatically, not pointedly, just a fraction of a hand's width. Her reaction was immediate and involuntary. Her breath caught. Her hand lifted slightly as if to intercept it, then froze mid-air before settling rigidly on her lap. Hamish's eyes narrowed. "Curious," he murmured. "The simplest things tend to reveal the most." He watched as Morag's composure returned, carefully measured. But the crack had appeared, no matter how briefly. Her attempt to mask it drew his attention more than the reaction itself. Fiona noticed it too, eyes narrowing in subtle confusion at her cousin's friend, but Hamish ignored that for now. The psychological play was working, producing the slightest betrayal of instinct. He pressed further. "The stone," he said casually, "wasn't part of the house. Someone brought it here. Not randomly either. The black circle, I suspect it had meaning to someone involved. Perhaps it reminded them of something long ago." Fiona leaned back, as if to distance herself from the conversation. Morag's hand flexed against her lap, a tension Hamish noted immediately. He allowed them a beat of silence, letting the weight of the unspoken press against them. Then Hamish spoke again, this time softly, almost conspiratorially. "Some people are willing to speak when they think the walls themselves know the truth. Others can't help but betray it, even when they try to act indifferent." Morag's eyes flicked to the ledger, then to the stone, and she swallowed hard, a subtle gesture that might have gone unnoticed in any other context. Hamish knew it for what it was, the first voluntary fracture in the polished mask of calm she had maintained for days. The reaction was almost imperceptible, yet precise, the kind of clue that no forensic method could uncover, but which spoke louder than any physical evidence. He stood slowly, stepping back and letting the moment settle. Morag's composure returned after a few heartbeats, yet Hamish could feel the tension under the surface, the thought racing that she had been caught, however fleetingly, by memory and instinct. It was enough to guide him toward the next move in the investigation, enough to suggest that the truth was not in the false victory, nor in the staged crime scene, but in the subtle interplay of human behaviour, old grudges, and the quiet reminders of the past. As Hamish left the cottage that evening, the mist curling low over the hills once again, he felt the first sense of progress in days. The unconventional tactic had revealed what the ledger, the stone, and the footprints could not, the precise location of a weakness, a fissure in the deception. And somewhere in the village, the real culprit remained, still confident that their careful orchestration had eluded discovery. Though Hamish now knew that the smallest instincts, the unguarded reactions, were already betraying them. The following morning, Hamish returned to the MacLeod cottage with the ledger under his arm, intending to trace the intricate web of old debts and grievances one more time. The village had grown quiet again, the fleeting optimism from the previous day already fading. He set the ledger on the table, opened it to the entries linking Ewan Mac Ray, Fiona Mac Leod, and Morag Fraser, and began jotting notes in the margin, connecting dates, amounts, and hints of past disputes. The patterns were clearer now, the tendrils of motive weaving through generations, yet he felt an unease in the air, a subtle tension he could not name. He stepped outside to clear his head, letting the crisp Highland morning brush against his face. When he returned 20 minutes later, the ledger was gone. His stomach sank. The book had been resting on the table, clearly visible, yet now it had vanished as if the floor itself had swallowed it. Hamish's eyes scanned the room, noting that nothing else appeared disturbed. The white stone still lay where it had been, untouched. No footprints or signs of forced entry marred the kitchen floor. Whoever had taken the ledger knew precisely what they were after, and had done so with practiced care. Panic did not enter Hamish's mind. He had seen this before. Someone was working deliberately to obscure the past, to erase evidence that connected motive to opportunity. He questioned the villagers, carefully, casually, watching for the subtle reactions he had learned to read. Fiona's face went pale when he mentioned the ledger, her hands fluttering at her sides. Morag's composure was immediate, her eyes sharpening for just a fraction of a second before she smiled politely and claimed ignorance. Ewan Macrae, too, seemed unusually rigid, clearing his throat before muttering that he hadn't seen it. Hamish knew the thief was among them. It was not a random act. It was a calculated move to derail the investigation before the threads of history and resentment could be fully revealed. He returned to the kitchen, crouched, and examined the tabletop and floor. Tiny scratches along the edge of the table suggested the ledger had been slid away with a deliberate push rather than lifted. Dust on the floor bore the faint outline of a footstep, so slight it might have been missed entirely, but Hamish noticed the angle and weight distribution. This was someone small, perhaps slender, someone who knew exactly where to place their weight to avoid detection. Theft heightened the stakes. Without the ledger, the carefully documented motives and connections were at risk of being lost forever. Hamish realized that the orchestrator of the crime was actively manipulating the flow of information, forcing him to rely more on instinct, observation, and the small cracks in behavior he had already noted. It was a dangerous escalation, an attempt to shape the narrative, to control the investigation before the truth could surface. Hamish left the cottage and walked the village lanes, retracing the potential routes the thief might have taken. He considered who had access and opportunity at the precise moment. Fiona, who had been lingering near the house; Morag, whose back garden and lane access offered easy entry and exit; even Ewan, who might have slipped in unnoticed under the guise of tending sheep. All of them had reason to intercept the ledger, yet none fit perfectly. The person was clever, precise and patient, someone willing to take calculated risks to bury evidence. By late afternoon, the tension in the village had grown palpable. Whispers followed Hamish down the lanes, neighbours glanced furtively at one another, as if suspecting complicity they could not yet name. The stolen ledger transformed the investigation from a methodical unravelling of motives into a high-stakes puzzle of misdirection. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle hesitation now had added weight. Hamish paused by the edge of the village, the wind tugging at his coat, and considered the implications. The white stone, the ledger, the carefully staged murder, they were all threads in a deliberate design. Someone was steering events from the shadows, forcing him to follow their lead, manipulating the evidence, to misdirect attention from the true culprit. And yet, Hamish knew that in moments like this, desperation often betrayed the cleverest individuals. The ledger might have vanished, but the person who took it would reveal themselves, if only through the instinctive, unguarded reactions that Hamish had learned to read. As dusk fell, the village seemed to hold its breath. The stolen ledger was a clear message. The investigation was under scrutiny, the stakes had risen, and trust, already fragile, was now a dangerous commodity. Somewhere in Drimnan the real criminal moved with confidence, thinking the trail had been obscured, unaware that Hamish Macbeth was already observing, patient and methodical, waiting for the smallest misstep that would betray them. The following morning Drimnan awoke to a tension that felt heavier than any mist. Hamish Macbeth had barely finished retracing the previous day's movements, reviewing the subtle details of the stolen ledger in his mind, when the cry rang out from the village square. It was not the scream of grief this time, but something sharper, sudden, a shriek of panic that shattered the brittle calm. Villagers poured into the square, faces pale, voices trembling. Near the edge of the green, the innkeeper's dog cowered beside its overturned basket, and in the shadows of the inn's doorway lay the body of Ewan Macrae. He'd been found sprawled across the cobblestones, a thin line of blood marking his temple, eyes wide in frozen surprise. It appeared instantaneous, almost surgical. No struggle, no weapon left behind, only a hastily scrawled mark on the ground beside him, a small black circle, faintly resembling the white stone from the MacLeod cottage, drawn with deliberate care. Hamish moved quickly, pushing past the cluster of villagers. The scene was eerily similar to the first crime, precise, almost choreographed, leaving a single, unmistakable clue that pointed to the killer's signature. He crouched beside Ewan, noting the angle of the fall, the absence of defensive marks, the faint traces of mud on the soles of the victim's boots. This was not a crime of passion, this was a statement. He, constable, pale and flustered, attempted to take charge, barking questions at witnesses, but Hamish's attention was drawn to subtler details. The innkeeper mentioned seeing someone moving quickly through the lane behind the cottages, just before the scream. No one had paid the slightest attention to the figure, assuming it was a villager on routine business, but Hamish felt the hair on his neck prick. The killer was mobile, confident, watching, waiting, and now escalating. He turned to the witnesses gathered around, noting their reactions. Fiona MacLeod's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting nervously from the body to the cottages. Morag Fraser's composure was rigid, almost mechanical, yet her fingers flexed at her sides in ways she clearly did not intend. Hamish did not speak yet. He let them reveal themselves through the tiny fractures in their facades. Barrrr! Mish's mind raced. The theft of the ledger yesterday, the first staged murder, the carefully placed white stone, and now this second death, all pointed towards someone several steps ahead, someone orchestrating chaos while maintaining perfect control over timing and opportunity. The connection between Ewan's death and the first crime was unmistakable, yet the method was refined, adapted. The villain was learning, testing, evolving. He examined the drawn black circle beside Ewan's body. It was precise, as though executed by someone accustomed to manipulation, someone who enjoyed the psychological effect as much as the act itself. The killer had sent a message. The past was not enough. The present had been rewritten, and Hamish now faced the prospect that unless the pattern was interrupted, there would be another act, another victim. Hamish moved through the square with deliberate calm, observing villagers' expressions, noting glances that lingered too long or shifted too quickly. Someone here knew more than they admitted. Someone was complicit, or at the very least dangerously close to the truth. The suddenness of Ewan's death had thrown the investigation off balance, but Hamish felt the sharp edge of opportunity amid the chaos. The killer had revealed a weakness, the same impatience that had allowed the subtle psychological test with Morag to work the day before could be exploited. Now, he crouched beside Ewan once more, tracing the faint footprints that led toward the lane. Only a careful observer would have noticed them, and the marks suggested a fleeting presence, someone small or careful, moving against the wind and light. Hamish's lips pressed into a thin line. The killer was not just clever, they were audacious, willing to strike while everyone assumed the case was progressing along predictable lines. By evening, Hamish had established the pattern. The villain thrived on manipulation, misdirection, and timing. The first murder had drawn attention, the stolen ledger had obscured motive, and now the second death had reminded everyone that the game was ongoing. Drimnan had learned to fear the shad. Ours in their village, but Hamish knew that fear alone would not solve the case. He would need patience, precision, and a readiness to act before the next calculated move. The stakes were higher than ever, and he understood now that solving the murder was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about preventing the next strike before the killer could claim it. Hamish walked the empty village lanes as night fell, the chill in the air sharpening his thoughts. Ewan's body had been taken. The constable was still struggling to manage panicked villagers, and the stolen ledger had left a gaping hole in the documentation of motives. Yet amidst the confusion, Hamish felt a spark of clarity, the sense that the chaos was not random, that the killer's actions followed a rhythm waiting to be deciphered. He returned to the MacLeod cottage once more, scanning the familiar rooms with a deliberate, methodical eye. The white stone lay where it had always been, its black circle staring up like a silent witness. Hamish crouched beside it, tracing the faint smudges on the floor. It had been moved subtly over time, nudged ever so slightly during previous visits, and only now did the significance of the placement strike him. The stone was never meant to be a clue for the authorities. It was a signal to someone intimately familiar with the village's routines, someone who expected Hamish to notice its movement, someone who delighted in subtle communication. She examined the kitchen. His gaze fell on a tiny detail that had gone unnoticed before, a faint scratch along the edge of the pantry door, just above where a shelf had once rested. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet it aligned perfectly with the ledger's disappearance. Hamish crouched lower, following the path of the scratches across the floor. They led toward the back door, stopping just short of the threshold. The implicatio. N was clear. The thief had never needed to exit fully. Whoever had taken the ledger had moved it through precise, controlled manipulation, entirely within the confines of the cottage. Then Hamish's mind wandered back to Morag Fraser, to the subtle reaction she had shown when the white stone had been nudged in the previous psychological test. The hand that flexed against her lap, the flicker of recognition in her eyes. It had seemed insignificant at the time, almost an instinctive twitch. But now, with the scratches and the ledger's disappearance, it formed part of a larger pattern. The same person who had reacted to the stone had the knowledge, the skill, and the proximity to manipulate the ledger without leaving obvious evidence. Hamish traced the outline of the footprints again in his mind, connecting them to the timing of Fiona's arrival, the moments when Morag had been near the back lane, and the slight discrepancies in Ewan's movements. At last, a picture began to emerge, not just of opportunity, but of intentional orchestration. The killer was weaving events together with precision, using the habits and histories of the villagers against them. The ledger, the white stone, the black circle beside Ewan's body, they were all instruments in a carefully composed sequence designed to mislead and intimidate. A final detail solidified the emerging pattern, the placement of objects within the Macleod cottage. Each item disturbed, each mark on the floor, each nudge of the white stone coincided with a known habit of a particular villager. Hamish realized that the killer had assumed everyone's routines as constants, exploiting them with surgical exactness. And yet, it was precisely this reliance on predictability that could betray them. The patterns were too consistent, too methodical. They were created by someone confident in their knowledge of others, and confident people, oft. Overlook the unpredictability of instinctive human reactions. Hamish stood and moved to the window, looking across the square. The village slept uneasily under the gathering night, unaware that the pieces of the puzzle were finally aligning. The killer had believed they were invisible, manipulating events from the shadows, confident that the false narratives and stolen evidence would prevent anyone from seeing the truth. But the pattern was now clear. Small gestures, habitual movements, and the subtle marks left behind were guiding Hamish toward a single reality. The breakthrough was simple, almost maddening in its clarity. The key to the entire case had been in plain sight all along, not in grand gestures, not in dramatic statements, but in the minutiae. Tiny habits, instinctive reactions, and carefully placed objects that revealed as much as they concealed. The web of deception had been intricate, but Hamish now saw the threads, the rhythm, the signature of the orchestrator. Every act, every movement, every calculated misdirection pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The murderer had left a trail, and it was Hamish's task to follow it before another life was claimed. As he stepped back from the window, the Highland night deep around him, Hamish felt the first surge of quiet satisfaction since the murders began. The pattern had emerged. The chaos had a design, and in that revelation, he knew he was finally close to turning the tables on the person who had believed themselves untouchable. Hamish spent the night in quiet reflection, retracing the threads of the case in his mind. The pattern of the murders, the stolen ledger, the white stone, and the subtle reactions of the villagers all pointed to a single orchestrator, yet the motive remained elusive. Money, inheritance, old grudges. These were the obvious explanations, but they did not account for the precision His psychological manipulation, the almost artistic nature of the crimes. The true motive lay deeper, buried beneath layers of resentment, fear, and obsession. The next morning, Hamish returned to the McLeod cottage, bringing with him the ledger he had managed to retrieve discreetly from the constable's office. He examined it once more, connecting dates, debts, and disputes with careful notes in the margins. Then, almost on impulse, he sought out Morag Fraser. There was something in her earlier reactions, the micro-expressions that revealed instinctive guilt, that demanded closer attention. "Morag," he said gently, stepping into her back garden, "we've spoken about the past disputes, but I wonder if we've missed something. Something not about money or land." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her face before she masked it with polite composure. I don't understand," she said, though her voice betrayed a quiver. Hamish stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You've been very careful, very precise, but the patterns, the placements, the reactions, they reveal more than you intended. This isn't just about disputes or inheritance. There's something personal driving this, something you thought no one could see." He swallowed hard, her hands flexing at her sides. For a moment, the air seemed to thicken with unspoken confession. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to speak, haltingly at first, then more fluidly. "Angus. He was going to expose it," she whispered, glancing around as if the village itself could hear. "All those years, everyone believed it was just old grudges and small quarrels, but he knew. He knew something I could never let surface." Hamish listened, piecing together the hidden motive from her fractured words. It was not greed, not petty revenge. It was the protection of a secret long buried, a shameful event from the past, one that would ruin reputations and lives if revealed. The ledger, the precise placement of the stone, the careful orchestration of the murders, all had been designed to manipulate perception, to create confusion, and to prevent discovery. Morag had acted out of a profound psychological need to control the narrative, to erase the threat of exposure before it could destroy her carefully constructed world. She continued, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I only wanted to stop him. I thought if I could make it seem like it was an accident, someone else, anything but me." Her words faltered, leaving the full horror of her reasoning suspended in the chill morning air. Hamish's mind catalogued the details, the subtle psychological manipulations, the meticulous staging, the misdirection of villagers, the theft of evidence. It all made sense now. Morag's actions were fueled not by immediate gain or rage, but by fear and obsession, a desperate attempt to safeguard a past she could not allow to surface. Every step of the murder sequence had been calculated to maintain control, to manipulate memory and perception, to ensure that the truth remained hidden beneath layers of ordinary village life. He watched her carefully, noting the interplay of shame, fear, and determination in her expression. This was a mind capable of cold calculation, yet twisted by the compulsive need to protect a secret. The brilliance of her manipulation had been in the details, the micro-expressions, the precise timing, the use of familiar objects like the white stone to evoke psychological responses. The violence had not been random. It had been a measured instrument of control, designed to enforce her own version of justice. Hamish finally spoke, his voice steady, measured. "It's over now, Morag. The pattern is clear, the evidence undeniable. But understanding why you did it, that is the key to preventing further harm." She looked at him, tears glistening, the weight of her confession settling over her. "I couldn't let anyone know," she whispered. "I couldn't." And in that moment, the hidden motive, so far more complex and twisted than anyone could have imagined, was revealed. It was a crime rooted not in greed, nor in revenge, but in fear, obsession, and the desperate, controlling mind of someone who believed that truth itself could be destroyed before it ever saw the light. Hamish spent the remainder of the day preparing, methodically setting the stage for a confrontation he knew had to be precise. The village of Drimnan seemed quieter now, the usual hum of gossip replaced by a tense anticipation that no one could name. The murders, the stolen ledger, the subtle psychological manipulations, it all converged into a single thread, and Hamish was ready to pull it tight. He knew the killer would act again if given the opportunity. and he intended to be waiting. He arranged a meeting with Morag Fraser under the guise of returning the ledger she had accidentally left behind. The MacLeod cottage was empty, the early evening light casting long shadows across the floorboards. Hamish positioned himself near the doorway, ledger in hand, eyes scanning every corner for the slightest movement. The air was thick with anticipation. Every detail mattered. Hen Morag arrived. She carried the calm composure she had perfected over the past days, yet Hamish noted the small betrayals, the quick flicker of her eyes toward the back door, the tension in her shoulders, the ever-so-slight tremor in her hands. He closed the door behind her, deliberately leaving it slightly ajar, and spoke in his quiet, measured tone. "Morag," he began, placing the ledger on the table with a soft thud. "We've talked about the past, about fear and secrets. But you know why I'm here. We both understand. ND the pattern now. You can't manipulate it any longer." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Hamish, she started, but her voice faltered under the weight of his gaze. He moved closer, deliberately calm, giving her space to respond, yet holding the pressure in the silence. "The ledger, the stone, Ewan's death. Every detail points to you. You believed the pattern would hide you, but it revealed more than you intended. Now, there's no need for further harm." Morag's eyes darted to the window, toward the back lane, and then back to him. Hamish noticed the instinctive calculation, the split-second thought of escape. He didn't move, he didn't need to. The trap was set, not with ropes or locks, but with the clarity of exposure and the inevitability of consequence. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the room. "I only wanted to stop it from coming out. I thought if I controlled it." Her words broke, the composure she had maintained finally cracking. Hamish's eyes remained steady, his presence unyielding yet non-threatening. "Control through manipulation has consequences, Morag. The pattern doesn't lie, and neither do the small truths you couldn't mask, the reactions, the habits, the instinctive movements. They've guided me straight to you." She took a step back toward the window, a fleeting thought of escape flashing across her face. Hamish anticipated it, not with aggression, but with calm authority. "There's no need for that. I already have all the pieces. Confession is the safest path, and it is the only path that prevents further tragedy." Morag froze, the last shred of her composure wavering. Her eyes, wide and fearful, followed the ledger on the table, as if it contained the power to absolve or condemn. She sank into the nearest chair, a shudder passing through her. "It was all supposed to stay hidden," she whispered. "The ledger, the secrets. I never meant for anyone to die. I only—" Hamish nodded slowly, allowing the silence to carry the weight of her guilt. "I understand, but intent cannot erase action. The evidence, the pattern, the psychological breadcrumbs, they all point here. It ends tonight, Morag." The tension hung thick between them, the room heavy with unspoken history and the inevitability of consequence. Morag's shoulders slumped, the last defences of fear and deflection collapsing under the combined weight of exposure and Hamish's unyielding calm. Finally she whispered a single defeated word: "Yes." The confession, soft and trembling, confirmed every insight Hamish had pieced together over days of meticulous observation and patient deduction. The trap had not been one of force but of understanding. The pattern revealed the instinctive, cracks exposed, the truth undeniable. Morag had no need to flee. There was nowhere to hide from the clarity of evidence and the inevitable reckoning of conscience. As Hamish guided her through the steps of surrendering to the authorities, the village seemed to exhale collectively, though still uneasy. The manipulation, the fear, and the orchestrated terror had reached their end. The MacLeod cottage, once the stage of fear and confusion, now stood as a quiet testament to the patient, precise work of observation, reasoning, and understanding. Hamish knew the truth had been revealed, and the shadow that had haunted Drimnan was finally brought into the light. The village of Drimnan had begun to settle into a tentative calm. Morag Fraser had been taken into custody, her confession laying bare the long-hidden motive and meticulous planning behind the murders. Hamish Macbeth walked through the quiet lanes, the Highland wind carrying a chill that felt sharper than usual. The villagers, though relieved, still moved cautiously, though the night itself had left a residue of fear. Hamish allowed himself a small sense of closure, enough to acknowledge the work done, but never enough to relax entirely. He returned to the MacLeod cottage to review the final details one last time. The ledger, retrieved from police custody, lay open on the table. The white stone rested quietly nearby, innocuous now in the absence of manipulation. Hamish moved through the rooms, retracing his steps, observing the faint traces of previous activity, the scratches on the pantry door, the displaced furniture, even the subtle smudges near the windows. They all pointed to Morag, or so it seemed, bar. He was examining the ledger a second time when a sound from the back lane caught his attention, the soft shuffle of feet against stone, too deliberate to be casual. Hamish straightened, ears straining, and moved toward the window. There, under the dim glow of a lantern, a figure lingered, tall, composed, and watching. The wind carried the faint rustle of clothing as the figure moved, almost imperceptibly, then retreated. Hamish's instincts flared. Something was off. Morag had confessed, but the precision of the crimes, the orchestration. And now this visitor suggested another layer yet undiscovered. He quickly left the cottage, moving through the narrow lanes with quiet determination. The figure had vanished from the immediate view, but Hamish noticed the faint footprints in the damp soil near the hedges. The pattern was deliberate, leading toward Fiona MacLeod's house. That small, seemingly mundane detail, the way the footprints curved around obstacles, the pressure of the step, alerted him to a possibility he had not fully considered. Morag might have been the executor, but someone else could have been the mastermind, orchestrating events from behind the scenes. Mish arrived at Fiona's doorstep, knocking firmly yet quietly. Fiona ope. Ned the door, surprise flashing across her face. Hamish, Morag confessed. Everything's over, isn't it? Hamish studied her carefully, noting the slight flush on her cheeks, the way her hands gripped the doorframe. It's not over until every thread is accounted for, he said evenly. I need to ask a few questions about last night, about who might have known more than Morag admitted. Fiona hesitated, glancing past him as if calculating whether to call for someone. Then, almost imperceptibly, she stepped aside. I suppose you should come in. Her voice carried a tension that betrayed more than casual compliance. Inside. Hamish examined the room, noting subtle irregularities. A chair slightly out of place, a faint smear on the windowsill, and a ledger page tucked carelessly under a pile of correspondence. He picked it up and scanned the notes. Details of old disputes, yes, but also annotations that Morag could not have known. Timings of villagers, movements, subtle reminders of private conversations, and references to her psychological reactions during the investigation. Someone else had been watching, cataloguing, and nudging events in ways designed to ensure Morag's compliance and mistakes. Fiona, Hamish said softly, keeping his voice calm but firm. These notes, they indicate knowledge of events that only someone very close could have had. Morag executed the plan, yes, but she was being guided. Someone else was pulling strings. Fiona's composure wavered, the mask of innocence cracking just enough. I didn't mean... I only... Her words trailed into silence, the confession teetering on the edge. Hamish's eyes narrowed, scanning her expressions and gestures, the small tells that revealed intent. You orchestrated this from the background. Morag was your instrument, not your accomplice. Every step, every manipulation, designed to protect your secret, while keeping yourself invisible, and yet the smallest details betrayed you. Her lips trembled, and for the first time genuine fear flashed in her eyes. I only wanted to protect the family, she whispered. I didn't intend for anyone to die. Hamish nodded, noting the mixture of justification and desperation. Intent cannot erase action. You used Morag to control events, and that orchestration is what escalated the violence. The village's fear, the deaths, the manipulation, all of it traces back to your choices. Fiona sank into a chair, the weight of realization crushing her defences. Hamish allowed a beat of silence, letting the truth settle in the room, heavy and undeniable. The last-minute twist, The revelation that the mastermind had remained hidden behind the confessed executor shifted the case entirely. Morag had been the visible hand, but Fiona had been the guiding force all along. Hamish stepped back, satisfied yet vigilant. The case finally had exposed the full depth of human cunning and fear, revealing that even when one thread is uncovered, another may still be hidden in the shadows, waiting for the patient and perceptive detective to find it. The village would slowly begin to heal, but the intricate interplay of control, fear, and secrecy had left an indelible mark, one that Hamish Macbeth understood better than anyone, and one he had unravelled, thread by meticulous thread. The village of Drimnan remained cloaked in the chill of early winter as Hamish Macbeth escorted Fiona Mac Leod toward the constable, her face pale and eyes downcast, shadows of fear and resignation etched into her features. The confessions, layered and intricate, had revealed the dual nature of the crimes. Morag had been the executor, guided by Fiona's careful orchestration from behind the scenes. Each step of the murders, the stolen ledger, the calculated psychological manipulations, they were threads in a tapestry of control and fear that now lay exposed. Hamish walked beside her, letting the quiet of the village lanes settle the nerves of the moment. He recounted, softly yet clearly, the sequence that had revealed Fiona's hand. The ledger, he said, was not just a record of debts or grievances, it was a map of influence, of behaviour. The small annotations, the timing of visits, the subtle prompts to Morag, even the positioning of objects in the MacLeod cottage, these were all orchestrated to steer perception. E paused at the edge of the village green, the wind tugging at his coat, the white stone, the black circle drawn beside Ewan MacRae's body, the carefully staged reactions of the villagers. They were psychological levers designed to provoke responses while keeping the orchestrator invisible. Morag executed the plan with precision, but the guiding hand was yours. Ona did not speak. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her, the weight of her actions pressing down. Hamish continued, pointing out the hidden clues that had been overlooked, the scratches along the pantry door, the subtle nudge marks on the floor. The exact placement of the ledger to ensure its disappearance went unnoticed until it served the purpose of misdirection. Each small detail, he said, was a signature, a breadcrumb left for those paying attention. Most overlooked them, but they spoke volumes if you knew how to read them. E. Constable appeared at the far end of the lane, ready to take custody. Hamish gave Fiona a final, measured look. The pattern was clear to anyone who watched carefully. The combination of opportunity, knowledge, and instinctive responses, those were the keys. You relied on everyone's assumptions, on the belief that no one would notice the subtleties. But you underestimated human observation, and you underestimated me. Fiona lowered her eyes, the confession complete in silence. Justice, at least as the village understood it, had been served, the manipulator captured, the executor acknowledged, and the truth fully laid bare. Yet there was an unsettling weight to the resolution, a lingering sense of unfinished business that even the village square, quiet and still, could not entirely dispel. Hamish sensed it, the awareness that clever minds, driven by fear and obsession, could always find ways to manipulate circumstances, that even when the visible hand was restrained, shadows remained. He reflected on the missed details that had nearly allowed the orchestrator to succeed completely, the tiny, nearly imperceptible alignment of footprints in the lane, the way the stone had been subtly nudged to elicit instinctive responses, and the almost imperceptible changes in villagers' behaviour under pressure. These were clues that only a patient, observant mind could integrate, piecing together motive, method, and psychology into a coherent picture. Hamish stood on the steps of the MacLeod cottage, looking down the empty lane. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of footsteps that no longer existed. In a village like Drimnan, quiet as it seemed, the past lingered beneath the stones and the mist, and even with justice served, the shadows of human nature, the fear, the obsession, the desire for control, remained, waiting for the next patient observer to notice them. He turned back toward the constable, who was guiding Fiona away, and nodded. The case was officially closed, yet Hamish felt no triumph, only the satisfaction of understanding. The truth had been revealed, the pattern uncovered, and the subtle cues that had been missed by others now told the story fully. Justice had been delivered, yet the knowledge that cunning and fear could persist in silence left him vigilant, in Drimnan as in all. Villages, the line between closure and lingering shadows was thin, and Hamish Macbeth, ever observant, knew precisely where it ran. The evening had settled over Drimnan, the mist curling low along the cobblestone lanes as Hamish Macbeth walked slowly back toward the edge of the village. The chill of winter clung to his coat, the weight of the day, of confessions, revelations, and carefully unravelled patterns, pressed more heavily on his mind. Morag and Fiona had been taken into custody, the confessions recorded, and the ledger safely returned. The village, for the first time in weeks, felt almost normal, though a subtle tension lingered like a shadow at the edge of perception. Hamish paused near the small bridge at the northern end of the village, gazing down at the water, black and still beneath the dim lantern light. The events of the past days played through his mind like a careful puzzle: the white stone, the stolen ledger, the perfectly timed psychological manipulations, and the subtle cues that had revealed the hidden mastermind. He had followed the pattern, pieced together the motives, and witnessed the confessions that laid bare the web of fear and control. Yet even in this apparent closure, a tiny nagging detail refused to settle. It was the small, almost imperceptible mark on the underside of the ledger's cover, a faint smudge that did not match Morag's handwriting or Fiona's annotations. Hamish had noticed it briefly during the interrogation, dismissed it as a minor oversight, but now, in the quiet of the evening, it returned to his thoughts. The mark seemed deliberate, a symbol that did not belong to the known sequence of events, almost like a silent signature left for someone who understood its meaning. He crouched, brushing his fingers lightly over the surface, and the chill of intuition ran down his spine. It hinted at someone else entire, who might have been influencing events without leaving a trace of identity. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from the lane behind him. Hamish's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows for movement, yet nothing appeared. Still, the instinct persisted. There was more beneath the surface than had been revealed, a hidden layer yet untouched by confessions and evidence. Drimnan had presented one resolution, but in his experience every solved case carried the echoes of unanswered questions. He rose, pulling his coat tighter, and walked the lanes back toward the cottages. Villagers had retreated indoors, and the lights in the windows flickered softly, casting warm rectangles against the dark streets. Hamish paused outside the MacLeod cottage, his gaze lingering on the white stone lying innocently on the doorstep. The object that had sparked the unravelling of psychological manipulation now seemed almost too simple, too benign. Yet he knew better. Every element of the case had been purposeful, chosen to evoke reaction, and perhaps to leave one final whisper behind. Slight breeze carried a rustle from the hedges near the lane, a sound almost like a footstep that didn't exist. Hamish's hand hovered near the lantern at his belt, but he did not move hastily. His mind catalogued every detail, every possibility, every unanswered question. Somewhere in the village, or perhaps beyond it, someone knew the full sequence of events, someone who had left the mark, the subtle hint, a final cryptic message meant to suggest the story was not fully over. Hamish continued walking, each step measured, his senses alert to the faintest irregularity. The case had been ostensibly closed, justice had been served, the culprits apprehended, the village safe for now. Yet the lingering doubt, the whisper of something yet unresolved, followed him like a shadow. Perhaps it was another manipulator, or an old secret still buried in the past, waiting for the right moment to surface. Perhaps the white stone, the ledger, or the mark he had barely noticed would one day reveal another layer, another puzzle to solve. As he reached the edge of the village, where the hills stretched into the dark horizon, Hamish allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. The patterns had been uncovered, the truth revealed, and yet the quiet murmur of mystery remained, a reminder that the world rarely offered finality. For now, The village would rest, the culprits accounted for, and the streets would be calm. But Hamish knew better. In Drimnan, as in life, every ending carried the seeds of the next enigma. He lifted his gaze to the distant hills, the lanterns of the cottages glowing faintly behind him, and with a final glance over his shoulder, Hamish Macbeth walked on, alert and watchful, ready for whatever subtle hint, tiny mark or unspoken clue, might herald the next mystery waiting to be unravelled. The village slept, but the story, as always, had not truly ended.